and welcome to another SonicLAB. We're taking another look at the Cobalt8 here, which is a sort of more in-depth. If you've not seen our original look, which was kind of a first look, a flip-through patches and just an overview, then do check that out. This one is going to be a bit more in-depth, but I'm not going to go through everything because there are certain similarities. But before I start that patch, wow, I have to say, I've been, as I've been looking at this thing, I've been just programming. It feels very, it kind of encourages you to patch create. And that was one of the ones I did. And I've got some aftertouch going to the delay time, which really, and the filter, which just really opens out. So I'm really pleased with that patch. It's one of the finest I think I've created for a while. And if you're on Patreon, one of our supporters, I'll be putting all of these patch banks onto that as a download. It's one of the benefits you'll get if you're a supporter. So this Cobalt8, as we said in the overview, very similar or almost identical really in terms of look to the Argon8, apart from this lovely and very photogenic blue. There are some differences, however. One of the big questions that came up is like, oh, well, can't I just pour the firmware from Argon8 into this, or the firmware from this into the Argon8, which is, again, I've got an Argon8 here, and as you can see, it's a pretty much identical casing, just different colour, different legends. But apparently it's not quite that simple. The allocation of the DSP is very different in the Cobalt. In the Argon8, a lot of it went towards the wavetable and the interpolation, which is why we got all of that kind of very smooth stuff. In the Cobalt8, a lot of it goes to the ladder filter, this modelled ladder filter. In the Argon, it was a two-pole filter, less CPU intensive. So this requires a lot more DSP. Now, this is what Modal have told me, that they're not compatible. I don't know whether that means this has got more DSP or the allocation is different of the DSPs on it, but sadly you can't do that. So that's straight out of the way. So some real differences, as we said, we've got these oscillators, which are extended virtual analog, and they bring a lot more of the shaping controls to the front panel, which is what is the key to this, because immediately you're into a big tonal variance and tonal control, even before you hit the filter. Another major difference, we've got a third LFO here, which is on a shift function. And that gives us, again, more modulation possibilities. Effects, as far as I could tell, is the same. Everything else is pretty much the same. I would like to give a special mention to the keybed. Keybed is really nice. It's a Fatar keybed, and it's the sort of quality you'd expect on an instrument that costs a little bit more than the 580 quid this one does. And I think because this is DSP, a lot of the expense goes into the case and the physical components, because under the hood, obviously, it's code, which obviously has a value, but it doesn't have a manufacturer value, it has a creation value. So I suppose that's why that happens. So let's start here. Actually, it's been bugging me, I'm going to take this off first. So this is the oscillator section. So each voice has two oscillator groups. This is the mix control, which is nice and simple. Nice representation, and this changes the shape. We've got the algorithms here, so we'll start with a sine and we go through triangle, saw, square and pulse. Plenty of buzz and kind of low end here, but what then happens with these is we have the fine control, which generally will B1 control or B2 control, which what that does is it bring in spread. Now what spread does is clone the initial oscillator up to 4 times, starts by adding detune, then it goes into fixed intervals. 1 octave sub, 2 octave sub. These are all modulatable, so we can do all of this. It's all nice, but what that means is basically each oscillator group can have up to 4 oscillators, so we can get up to 8 oscillators per voice. They're not individually addressable, but they're sort of clones of each of the groups. So we can end up with quite a lot of oscillators stacked up. The thing that makes this really good, actually, is the fact that the algorithms and whatnot are really close to the surface. And being close to the surface means that we can change the tonal characteristics of the sound very rapidly. In the Argon 8, the wavetable is a little bit more buried. So on here, it's all right up front. So algorithm 1 is just straight VAs. Algorithm 2 is a variant on that. Then we get these kind of various different spreads. As we get into the higher numbers, remember there are 34 of these, there's some very interesting wave shapes. And these, what this does then is the spread doesn't necessarily do the cloning, but it does kind of additional functions. And we get into sync wave. Then one that fractal saw, this is kind of interesting. So sort of like sync waves. I mean, there's just a ton of these and they look very interesting. This almost sounds filtered, but it's not actually filtered. The filter is wide open. So some really interesting wave shapes. And the thing about them is because they're all so close to the surface, some more interesting ones as we go further up are these chaos and ring mod. If we go to chaos, we can affect sort of unquantized and quantized depending if it's the chaos or the ring mod. And then if we go even further up, there's quite a versatile noise oscillator as well. In fact, here's a little patch with I'm using the arpeggiator, where I'm using the noise and oscillator 1 against Anyway, I could do that forever. I mean, you know, that's the thing about this. Once you start going on it, even though, yes, there are a bunch of shift parameters, there's a lot of stuff that just sort of comes immediately out at you. And I do keep going on about this, but I have found it quite a pleasurable patch creation experience. In fact, I'm going to just save that one now. There we go. Oscillators are also tunable plus or minus 24 semitones. You can modulate the spread if you're in a regular kind of waveform as well. So in this patch, I'm using the modulation envelope to modulate the spread of oscillator 1. I'm not going to go through all of these because obviously there's 34 of them, but there are a bunch. Now there's more to this section because if we just go back to our straight algorithm and use a sawtooth just because it's a bit easier. These are continuously variable. So you can get some interesting modulation shapes. Anyway, sawtooth. We've also then got this drift parameter. If I just make the display a little bit bigger. So what that does is introduce a sort of element of randomness into the voices, because with DSP voices, quite often what happens is they can be so perfect, they can be a bit like a fine scalpel. It does something weird to you, but we can add this, we can accentuate this kind of drift and randomness to create these unpredictable results on each note. So if we went, say, let's go to a sine wave, add some release. Take the drift off, put the drift on full. There are these kind of slight variants in tuning which just make it sound a bit more analog. Now this is pretty effective but quite subtle. Would it be nice maybe at the very extreme ends to see some more wonkiness, because that's always nice to be able to dial in if you want it. Another neat feature is we can press shift and get into voice width, which throws out alternating voices wider, so we're getting sort of detune, width and colouring shape just in the oscillator section, and that's I think is the strong point of this synthesizer, because not only do they sound good, but they also are really tweakable straight away. And just coming back to some lower octaves, you can see there's a really good, that's a triangle, sawtooth. Really good kind of fundamental. They don't sound bad actually. Buzzy, and then filter that down a bit. Plenty of sort of thunder. And what they've, because they're very bright, we can then bring the filter into play, which will sort of tone down some of those particularly bright harmonics, but they're there in the first place. So time for a couple more sounds. I think, where did I start? So this one is... These are all unnamed because I haven't got around to naming them. They're just recorded. I think this one's the patch we just listened to. It's sort of brassy. And a few variants on that. It's an arpeggiator patch. Sort of 80s wide pad. If we go back to the beginning, this is what's patch naught. You can see there a good nice lot of frequency going on in that sound. Let's try another one. This one sort of demonstrates it in sort of more mono mode. I think we're in, so if we go to the sequence. Plenty of low end there, no lacking in that department. This one's a nice kind of almost... That's a sort of, that sounds almost wavetable-y, doesn't it? But that's, again, you know, just a sequence. I think that's got an arpeggiator on it, and you're starting to hear those effects that come in as well. But we should probably take a look at the filter, because a lot of the DSP's gone into that. It is a model filter. Let's take a look. So this is modelled on, or the basic filter shape is modelled on a resonant low-pass ladder filter, and it does that thing. Where introducing resonance will drop the bottom end, which is as you'd expect. Feels pretty good actually. I mean, I have to say it's very smooth. And then we've got the morph. We can go through to band pass, and then I think this is a one-pole filter. Again, this is modulatable. Only thing missing for me is there's no real control over the drive. It would have been nice to see that. Maybe that's something that's just beyond what the DSP is to model that, but I'd like to have been able to push the filter a bit harder and get a bit more distortion. In fact, there's no distortion in this anywhere as far as I could tell, which sort of goes against the modern trend of it, and I quite like a bit of distorted pads, but to be honest, it does sound very impressive. But there's a lot more to it, because if we come to the filter parameters, we've got a resonant low-pass filter, then we've got a balanced low-pass filter. What that does is actually introduce that bass compensation. So no bass compensation, bass compensation. Then we've got this balanced high pass filter, which doesn't quite pluck out those super low harmonics, but it's quite nice. Then we've got this balanced phase filter, which is really interesting. If I just bring that down a little bit and take the release up on the envelope and play some chords, there's quite a lot of low end there, but by tweaking the morph a little bit, I can clean that up just by sort of morphing through, which is very handy when you're dealing with 8 voices. And then if we went into a different kind of filter type, maybe let's go to that balanced phase filter and modulate some of that stuff. Let's go LFO1 and modulate this. The only thing missing for me is I would like to have some drive or some control over drive. I mean, it's got that smudge built into it, it just hasn't got a variable amount of drive, which I think would be one thing that I'd like to see. So look, it's not an analog filter, it is a model filter, but actually it has a decent character. I've got this sound here which has got a very low sweep, slow sweep on a balanced low pass. Resonance and plenty of effects and some of that voice width on it, and there's something about it, isn't there? I mean, you know, yes, it's DSP synth, but it's got a vibe, that's for sure. So let's come on to the LFOs. We've got 2 LFOs on the front panel plus a third LFO under a shift function. These are multi-shape. If I just bring the display up, you'll be able to see. We can change by pressing shift. We can change the shape through all the usual suspects, including sample and hold and sample and glide. We'll go back to our main mode there. In this patch, I've got LFO2 on the filter, LFO1 on the shape, and then LFO3 is bringing in a little bit of vibrato. So let's go back to our overlay, bring this up. So the way that I've got this set up, well actually before we go, let's just see what the sort of rate's like on this. That is the fastest that the LFOs will go. 2 and 3 are polyphonic and 1 is a global LFO. But we can also go back into tempo sync divisions as well. So yeah, the LFOs don't go into the audio rates, but maybe that's something to do with the fact that there are 3 of them as opposed to the Argonate's 2. One thing to mention though is obviously some of these oscillator types also have sort of inbuilt cross modulation and ring modulation, so you can get audio rate mod between audio sources relatively easily on those algorithms. Coming back to this, they're also polyphonic, so maybe if I go to shift and I change my shape to square, bring the speed up a little bit, and we'll just go. You can hear that they cascade. So the LFOs can be set to be polyphonic or monophonic. Obviously LFO3 is only monophonic because it's not 1 per voice, but that gives you all those sort of nice cascadey effects. Bit more about how this patch is working. LFO3, I press shift and the LFO button. Let me bring the display up. And now we're in LFO3 mode, so I can change the shape, obviously. I can change the mode, which gives me 3 running, and retrig, which is, you know, there's no one shot on this. In fact, I should point out in the other LFOs, you've got 3, retrig and 1 shot, so you can actually have them as a single cycle as well. What I'm doing with this, if I go to my mod slot assignments, we can see mod slot 1 is LFO 2 to filter cutoff, mod slot 2 is LFO 1 to wave shape, LFO 3 is global pitch, but then mod slot 4, what I'm doing is using this envelope to bring in the amount of vibrato. I press go. We're following this traversal, so we're getting this modulation path of the depth of LFO3 affecting. It's kind of a nice thing. It also brings us into this idea of the mod slots. Mod slots are very much the same of the Argon8. We can set them up so that you've got a source and a destination. Not everything will go to everything, because some things are monophonic parameters and some things are polyphonic parameters, and you can't control, say, with 1 per voice, the global parameter of something else. So there are kind of limitations, but that was the same with the previous synth as well, and many other synths that have multiple LFOs and multiple envelopes per voice. So let's have a crack at the sequencer. I've got an init sequence here. I'm going to record in real time because this has got up to 8 bars of real time and I think 8 bars of step time. It's quite an interesting way of working. It's got 4 layers of animation, and we've also got a metronome. So let's start with going into record. Let's see if I can go. I have to go round once because I'm not going to be able to start. There's no counting, even though there is a metronome. 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's all good. Now we've got these 4 lanes of animation. So I'm going to go into record again, which does bring the metronome on again, which is a bit irritating. Yeah, I don't know, it doesn't do that pickup, so let's see how that works the next time around. Seems to have worked the second time around. Okay, so let's record something else. I'm going to go for something wacky. Right, I'll wait for this to come out of the way, which is a bit, so I'm going to start here. 1, 2. Alright, but what I can do, I can go shift and I can mute. So I can mute that. Now I think, let's have a look. So come out of here. Sequence. Let's see what we can do here. We can change the step length, we can set the number of steps, we can have the overdub rates. There's a few, so we can mute the notes. So I guess that means now if I switch my other animation, yeah, we can use this as a sort of modulation, which is kind of crazy. Turn that, stop that. Now, actually, that's quite powerful. I like the fact that it's real time. I like the fact it's metronome. There may well be a setting in there to turn that down or turn it off in overdub mode. I'll have a look into that. But ultimately, I can throw down an idea, store the sequence, and then record these animations. But then I can take the notes out and use the sequence to be a modulator, which is always handy. Also got an arpeggiator in here, which is very useful. Fairly sort of standard stuff, but we've got different abilities, like we can set the arp rest and sequence loop, sequence hold. But to be honest, there's quite a lot of parameters sort of under the hood that we haven't gone into with the sequencer, and that's probably best accessed via the Modal app, which runs on Android, iOS, Windows and OS X. So you can sort of get it exactly how you want it, and then program it in, make it all neat and tidy and everything, and then use it for live playback. I can see that being very useful, or in terms of modulations for patches for recall later. Programming it all via the front panel is a little bit fiddly, just because there are shift functions and different modes and stuff, but it is entirely possible to use this in a performance situation. Okay, so let's take a look at the effects. I've got this little sequence that I put in step. Let's start with effects 1. They're pretty much the same as the Argon 8 as far as I could tell, so I'll bring this up. You do get a reduction in the overall level, but you can compensate for this in the patch volume if it's not loud enough for you. And you can get some pretty wonky stuff. Nice phaser, flanger, negative, positive, tremolo. Let's take that down. The second effect, I've got a ping pong delay, which can be tempo synced. We also go into these kind of very short, pingy kind of ones, and you can modulate these parameters from the mod matrix as well. Let's go back to 16 here. It's nice. And then the third one, I've got a reverb, and this can be quite big. All of these parameters have shift. All of these effects have some level of shift parameters. So we've got dampening, pre-delay, turn up the time. And yeah, they're not the finest effects money can buy. The reverb is a little bit pingy, but when encompassed, if you sit it right in the mix, it does create a lot of stereo width and a bit of body to it. Other effects are absolutely fine. Only thing missing for me is some kind of organic sounding sort of drive or distortion. It'd be nice to have that. I don't know how easy or how difficult that is to do in digital. Maybe it's quite hard, but that's the one thing I'm missing, particularly as we don't have that drive in the filter. But the effects, because they can integrate with the sound engine, you get a lot of that sort of sound design as part of the patch, which I think in a modern synth is always welcome. It's also possible to plug an external stereo mini jack into here, which brings a stereo signal in, which you can route directly to the effects or just straight to the audio output. Just a nice little bit of extra utility. Sync connections, which are handy for syncing up other Cobalts or other modal stuff in the modal universe. A pair of stereo outputs, headphone output on quarter-inch jack, MIDI in and out on full-size connectors. There's a sustain and an expression pedal input here as well, plus the USB, which is for MIDI and is very useful when you're hooking up the Modal app, which obviously comes in iOS, Android, Windows Desktop and Mac OS X. Then we've got the power, which is external power supply, and a switch. So the Cobalt8 is out now. As far as I understand it, it's kind of on the road, appearing in shops, should be well before Christmas. Price is about 580 quid, which I think is a really decent price for a synth like this. It's got a very nice build quality, and there's something about it. I mean, yes, there are certain limitations, but it all comes together as actually a really quite a compelling instrument. I've just been programming patches as I go, and they keep falling out of it, for me. There is, yes, a certain amount of shift functionality, but it's actually quite intuitive. I mean, I didn't find it was hard to get around once you kind of do it, because the legend is all nicely positioned on the front panel. It's very easy to get into. I think this feels like a real sweet spot for this kind of price point of the Modal Electronics range. There's something a little bit more compelling for me about this than there is about the Argon 8. I can't quite put my finger on it, but it just seems to sort of work as a whole thing just a little bit better. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the Argon 8, but this just feels there's something ooh about this. Literally, this news just in. I was just about to publish the review, but Modal have announced the Cobalt8M, which is the desktop, much in line with what they did with the Argon. That's going to be about £499 UK. And they've also announced the Cobalt8X, which is the 5-octave keyboard version, and that's going to be £649 UK. So before I play out, I just want to say thank you very much for watching, and don't forget, if you're interested in some of the patches I created here, I'll be posting these on our Patreon page, and there's a little bit of extra video from the Cobalt8 regarding MPE as well. Anyway, that's it. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time.